From Immersive Labs, this is Cyber Humanity. Hello all, I'm your host, Chris Pace, as always, and joined once again by the productizer, Paul Bentham.
Hello, everybody.
Mr. Nothing to CVE here, Kev Breen.
Hello.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Like
see?
we've done
I wasn't
there.
expecting that.
See?
Just read that.
And finally, Immersive Labs, the only person at Immersive Labs with cyber actually in his job title, Max Vetter.
Hello.
In these podcasts, we do try to focus on the human side of cybersecurity, and these come in two flavors, either us ranting about themes close to the hearts of security types, or us chatting about threat and security stuff from recent weeks. And this episode is one of those. I've half entitled this week's episode the Ethics episode because weirdly, when we started looking through all the stuff that we were researching, it turned out that all of these things kind of had this slight ethics angle, and hopefully that will come out as we go through the through the podcast. But we're going to start off by returning to one of our favorite one of our top
Paul's
five
favourites.
criminal gangs.
The unpronounceable ones.
The unpronounceables that we're just going to call them REvil from now on. And I think actually weirdly now the media have decided that they're just going to call them the REvil criminal gang, because I guess the ransomware variant is too complicated to.
Well, it takes so long to type Sadinakibi, doesn't it?
I don't know if it's just that. I think it's because they're trying to differentiate. They're trying to differentiate between the gang that's using the malware rather than just the malware variant itself. I think it's probably something to do with that.
They might move on to different malware, won't they? So
It's
Yeah,
ransomware
maybe.
as a service, so there is, in some cases, a distinction between which affiliate group has compromised and what the REvil gang are taking off that. So that is a fair distinction to make, I think.
Anyway, you would have had to have been on another planet to not know that the REvil criminal gang are now ransoming a. We talked about it last week. They're ransoming a law firm, US law firm, New York law firm, which has a lot of celebrity clients, and it turned out that one of those celebrity clients is the president of the United States, Donald Trump, and they have made they're trying to ransom. I don't know if it's the law firm or Trump himself, or I don't really know who they're trying to ransom, but somebody for a snip at $42 million to keep his files quiet. And of course, what that's done is it's given the story a kind of life of its own. So a week ago, it's only been covered by a bit of industry press and the odd mainstream news, and now suddenly it's everywhere. And there's a Vice article that's been pretty widely shared when this kind of first came out. But of course it leads us back to the question that we always have to we always end up asking, which is, do you pay the ransom? And in this context, when your victim is the president of the United States, they're a holder of public office, does that change anything?
It's a pretty big ransom. I mean, has the ransom ever been as big as this? $42 million. I mean, when it's like a couple of $100K here or there, you're like, maybe. Like if I'm a multi-billion-dollar business, 42 million. That's not a rounding error.
I know they've asked for millions before, like 1.5 or a couple. It was Travelex was like 7 from memory, somewhere around there.
But they only ended up paying 2.
Yeah, so
I think it's like it's like when you're going for a new job, go in high, and hope you get something. Yeah, if you pay it within 2 weeks, you can pay 50%. Yeah,
but from my memory on this, they're clever. The REvil group are quite clever here because they know that Trump has a lot of supporters, and they're not just asking him to pay. Anybody can contribute to it, isn't it? Isn't that the case? They're trying to get people to buy the data.
Yeah, well, this is sort of the start of this was Travelex, where they basically said, we haven't just encrypted the data, we've got it. And so what it's done is it's evolved the idea of ransomware as we've encrypted the files on your computers or on your network to we have taken that data, now we have it, and that means that we can do with it what we will.
Yeah,
so I think
aren't
it
they
is an
auctioning
evolution.
the data? Aren't they auctioning the data for 42, or are they offering the decryption keys for 42?
No, they're offering the decryption keys for 42, what they're attempting to do, and in their communications with the press, they're attempting to get the law firm to go to Trump and say, give us the money so that we can save your bacon, kind of thing.
Yeah, what they're saying is they're gonna publish it unless they pay. So it's kind of, and you get the decryption keys maybe. So it's kind of a threat as well as the decryption. It's kind of a bit different.
I love the way they've come in and said that they've pointed out that it's coming up to election time, and it will be interesting to see if they class this as election tampering or not.
Well, so that leads on to the whole thing about, because when we started talking about this, Paul said, "Oh yes, because I've seen that, now if you pay the ransom, that's illegal. You can't. They're saying that you can't pay the ransom because that's illegal." And that was the gist of this Vice article. It said in there was a quote from somebody, I forget who, that said, "Oh, the FBI have said that this is an act of terror, and so therefore it is, illegal to pay the ransom." Now that opens up, if that were the case, that opens up a whole can of potential political worms, because that suggests that if you're just a regular common or garden business getting hacked for millions, or ransomed for millions, then that's fine. You can pay the ransom. But if you're a person who holds a public office, or if you're a government entity that gets attacked in exactly the same way, you can't. And maybe that's always been the case. I don't know.
Well, I think we've talked about this previously on the podcast, but yeah, something like 80% of businesses who have ransomware do pay it. So it then, if they're then saying, well, dependent on the ransomware group, if they are cyber terrorists, then you become a terrorist organization by funding them. That definitely changes the whole, the whole side of this.
I think we're missing some really important stuff here. There is potentially some really interesting data here, isn't there? Like, I mean, there's been some very bad rumors about what the president has been up to historically, and if those are written down in legal, with legal privilege, and a ransomware group has got those, I mean, I'm going to read that article, so I really kind of hope that they don't pay.
So they got the suggestion was in the most recent bit of press about this. The suggestion was that they had got bored and ended up publishing some of the emails, but there wasn't really anything of any interest in there.
Yeah, I read that, and they said basically the emails just had most of the people in those emails were discussing Trump rather than actually the subject of Trump. But then apparently they said, "Oh, this is the least bad stuff."
They just grepped the word Trump.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, that's all they've done. And so they've got I had a Trump.
I don't think
that's worth paying the ransom for.
I don't think in America that means just saying no. I don't think in America that means the same thing. So I'm going to leave that to anyone who's in the States who's listening to this. Now you can just go and Google what does Trump mean in the UK, and you'll get a ton of hilarious responses.
So
and if you're trying to.
So it's Pebble Dashing from last week. Or...
Oh, yes. Operation Pebble. No, the malware was called Pebble Dash or something.
Yeah. One of the really sort of things to remember here is, can you just imagine how hard it is to go through, 769 gigabytes of, these aren't videos and images. This is documents. Imagine trying to trawl through all that stuff and work out what is and isn't interesting. It'll be mind-numbingly boring. And the fact that they've grepped for Trump and released that tells me enough about the fact that it will be impossible for them to know what's good and what isn't. If you remember when who was the journalist that did all the Snowden disclosures, Greenfield, the Guardian and the Washington Post spent months going through that, understanding the context. And redacting, it's complicated to process big treasure troves. And you either do what WikiLeaks did, and just dump it and, to hell with it, or you do what the Guardian and the Washington Post did and actually, go through it, redact it, try to understand it, etc. You can't be telling me that this malware group have got a bunch of journalists involved and have started understanding what data they do or don't have on the president. Like, they found the word Trump and they're like, woohoo, 42 million, we're getting a yacht.
Yeah, I think they're looking for a lever to pull. Mind you, I mean, I suppose we've got to say that the reality is that they're earning well out of this so far. It's there are organisations that are prepared to pay the ransom, some kind of ransom, in order to get what they need. So
Kevin, are any of our cyber guys got new cars recently, or got a new flat or anything? We ought to keep an eye on them.
Yeah.
I think this group is exclusively for a large Eastern European country. I think it's pretty obvious.
I think we're going to see them disappear soon.
The gang crab, the old gang crab, make tons
they
of money and retire.
They reckon this is an evolution of gang crab. It's the potential is it's the same kind of group behind it. But I think if they land if they were to get something this big, the amount of attention this is going to draw from the US in terms of like cyber tracking and like stuff like that, I think they're going to go quiet after this. Leave the affiliates to do their things. We'll start to see smaller impact, which will inevitably pave the way for some other group to come in and replicate their business model. But I think they're on the way out.
As it says in the article, that Kremlin generally turns an eye unless it's an ally of Russia. Now, would you categorize Trump as an ally of Russia?
That's complicated.
That's another podcast.
That's complicated.
Are we gonna vote on paying or not paying? If we haven't done
well,
that?
I was actually going to ask a different question. I was going to ask, in this example where the ransomed is a holder of public office, or a government, let's say a government official, or let's say a government agency or a government organization, does that change the terms of reference? Should there be a law against those kinds of organizations and individuals paying the ransom? Should it be illegal for them to do so? Like, what's our view?
We're doing what everybody else is doing. You put in the focus on the fact that they've got Trump's data. There's still a lot of other private individuals who are going to be affected by this as well. So,
but does that mean it's good, or do you mean you should pay then, or you shouldn't because of that?
Well, I mean, I'm saying that if paying the ransom clears everything, then maybe the US government has a responsibility to protect its citizens. If there's a large percentage of US citizens and they can pay to stop that amount of privacy invasion.
I think we all already know there is a totally separate justice system for celebrities in the US. So the American government's probably already decided that they're going to pay the ransom for them. Sorry, I've just finished I watched too many Netflix documentaries. I'm not a person to ask about this.
This is not. I'm not going with you on that, Kev. Like, it can't be a government's responsibility of its citizens to pay ransomware. Like, governments don't negotiate with terrorists. So, and you look at the hot water Qatar's got itself into by paying the ransom demands when hostages were taken. I mean, allegedly upwards of $1 billion have been paid to terrorists in the Middle East for taking Qatari nationals hostage. That didn't go down so well with their neighbours, and now you have to spend 14 hours getting from Doha to anywhere else in the Middle East. So I'm not with you on that, Kev. I don't think the government's going to be, shouldn't be stepping in. Now, of course, it's Trump's government, so anything could happen. But I wouldn't be supporting the British government doing that.
But ethically, on that question, I'm of no, don't pay. Don't ever give lots of your money to criminals. That's my ethical stance. I'm not saying if I was CISO of an organization and the CEO was, smashing down my door.
I love that.
During
ethically, you shouldn't pay the ransom, but operationally, here's my open checkbook. Please get me out of this terrible hole that I'm in.
Well, it's different, isn't it?
It's different. Well, it's different, isn't it? Yes, it's different.
But no, you made a good point. It is different for private sector where money is the end, whereas public sector where I don't know, if you're in an intelligence service, someone's life might be the goal.
The ethics aren't any different. The ethics are still the same.
No,
I
agree. But we know lots of people do it. even
Well, we know
though
you shouldn't do so. We recently ran an exercise working with KPMG, some of their senior people on the exercise, and when it came to the question of paying the ransom, they did get to a point where they said, what's the calculation? So based on the scenario that they were in, what they understood about their revenues on like, and we were talking on like a daily basis. What does our revenue look like today versus what's the ransom that's being demanded versus what's the impact operationally on that revenue? Once we've gone through that calculation, where does that leave us? And then let's talk about the ethics of it. So it was all to do with the mechanics and the economics first, and then the ethics afterwards.
I think that's a really interesting. So as we go forward, collecting those stats, because I would bet in a scenario environment, lots of people will say do not pay because they're being ethical. And then if we compare that to the real stats of how many people actually pay, I reckon generally in a scenario people will go, oh yeah, no, I can't pay, that's terrible. When they're actually in it and the CEO is smashing their door down, they're like, oh yeah, just pay it and get it done with. It'd be really interesting to collect those stats.
Also, I think it's really interesting when you start to think about people outside of the sphere of security, outside of the sphere of risk. In their example, it was the person who had taken the role of the CFO who was pushing for payment of the ransom. They understood the hourly, daily, weekly impact of them being offline, and so therefore they were much more, dare I say, pragmatic about the idea of paying the ransom. I'm not sure we really yet covered this. The question that I asked was, should it be illegal to pay? Should we just remove the possibility that people can get themselves, organizations can extricate themselves from these situations or attempt to by paying money? Or should we take that off the table and say, sorry, you've experienced it, you have to rebuild in exactly the same way as, if someone put a bomb inside your building and said, I'm going to detonate it, my understanding is you don't pay that ransom, right?
The interesting thing is that the bad guys do the same kind of thing. So they uphold, like a large percentage of the time, they uphold when you pay a ransom, they give you the decryption keys, because the first time they don't, they lose their business model. So if we were to remove that business model away from them, I think maybe we could start to see a decline in that, but it wouldn't stop them trying, and people would still suffer like heavy financial loss in those instances.
No government's going to make it illegal to pay the ransom because it's going to disadvantage the competitive nature of that organisation that's headquartered in that country.
You don't need the government to do it. All you need is the cyber insurance to null your its cyber insurance policy if you pay the ransom. So you could do it that way.
But isn't
Why
that-
would a
seems
cyber
tough.
insurance? But here's the thing, right? I'm a cyber insurance underwriter. Organisation has got a policy with me. They can pay out $5 million out of their pocket, no cost to me, for the cyber insurance, or they can claim against me for 200, whatever the number is, to rebuild the whole estate. Like economics, they're going to pay the ransom every single time.
I'm pretty sure there's a case, and I can't think who's. I think it might be Maersk is involved, where because the who hacked them is now defined. They say it
it's
might
an
be
act of
Russia.
war.
They say that is an act of war because it's a state against Maersk, and the cyber insurer has said we don't cover active wars.
We're going to have
acts
this
of war.
we're going to have the
what's really
attribution
interesting-
conversation again. We're going to have the attribution conversation again because the argument is in the an attribution is the hardest part of all of this. Like detection, response, even protection is easier than attribution, and yet now what we're trying to say is, well, dependent on where it originated and who it originated from decides whether it's an act of terror or not, which again is a little bit like saying, well, if MI5 burgled me, I can claim it on my insurance, but if someone else did, then I can't. I just that sounds like an absolute minefield, and I think this is where this was teetering towards, because the Russian connection had been made, and as soon as the Russian connection and Trump existed, then it was like, oh well, maybe they're cyber terrorists. But do we actually know of any cyber terrorists? Has anyone been indicted or locked up or like? No,
There
it's
was- there was
it's an
a-
They've been,
aftermath.
few
they've been
guys-
indicted.
Well, there's a few guys who hack some Twitter pages. There's you know, the Syrian cyber army or something. That's all they do. They go into some
America
Twitter
have
pages.
indicted 4 Chinese nationals as members of the PLA.
Yeah, that was a
that-
PR
yeah, that-
stunt.
yeah.
I'm not saying it's not
That
a
was-
PR
that's-
stunt,
that's
but there were
APT1.
real indictments.
That's where
There were real
APT1 came from.
indictments.
Yeah. But I think
what makes you a terrorist? I mean, like,
wow,
I
this
mean, I don't mean to be all like.
I wrote a whole essay on this in my masters.
Oh.
What
Is it on your
defines-
blog? Is it on
Yeah.
your personal
Yeah.
blog?
Can we move on? Can we move on?
But
It's about to get boring.
Going back to that case, though, the interesting part about that case is the cyber insurer or the company, which I think is Maersk. Neither of them, they're both going to settle, right? Because cyber insurer doesn't want to be seen as not insuring, even if it is defined as an act of war. And then Maersk also wants to get, so they both are going to settle.
They're basically saying we need some recompense for having to make this massive payment, plus having to recruit tons of consultants to come in and fix everything. I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so still on the subject of ethics, Kev's been busy this week. Last week we chatted briefly, and it was very briefly towards the end of the podcast, about a bit of malware called Anubis, one of our Near Eastern gods that we were discussing last week. And off the back of that, Kev went and did a bit of tinkering with it, and it's safe to say that things escalated. Kev, what went down?
Yeah, so we talked about Anubis. It started to get some popularity. So Anubis is a malware. It's banking malware targeting like Android devices. And as we like to do at Immersive Labs, we wanted to create a lab on this. So how could we equip defenders to protect themselves? And as part of this, I didn't want to do anything with live, so I went and found a copy of the malware and the C2 panel, so we could do all this good stuff.
What's
And
the C2
as I-
panel? Just before
So-
you, just
Really?
for our listeners.
So the APK file, which is installed on your device, is the malware. The C2 panel is the command and control. That's the web application the attacker uses, from where they direct all the actions that happen on all the infected devices. So as I was playing with this, as I like to do,
Probably
I
on a
dis-
weekend, probably like Saturday afternoon or something.
This was a weekend, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the details now because we're still going through the ethics on this. But I found a vulnerability in the malware panel that essentially allows me to completely take control of it.
Submit a CV for that.
Probably not. You can't quite submit a CV against a bit of malware.
How do you
But-
know it's malware? One person's malware is another person's,
Tool.
must-have app.
Yeah.
Remote access.
So the
Yeah,
the interest the interesting piece in this is from a good guy perspective, I have the ability to identify victims. So I can get a list of every phone number, every IMEI, every IP address of every infected device. I can also issue the uninstall command, the delete command, so I can just tell all the victims to clean themselves up and completely destroy the panel from the malware operator.
So that's what you did, right?
Therein
Like,
lies
if
the
this is
ethics.
a Marvel, if this is a Marvel movie,
Yeah, kill it
that's
all.
what Kev did.
You would have saved the world.
That's what you
Ken.
did, right?
The boring.
like,
That'd be the
no,
boringest
so-
movie ever.
Yeah.
All right.
So to clarify, just for any law enforcement who are listening, I absolutely didn't. This was all tested against my local test instances. What I did is I reported it to law enforcement, both in the UK and the US. I also talked to some people who have, they've done things like this themselves that I know in the community, and asked them for their guidance on the correct way. Because on one hand, yes, I could absolutely do this. I would be breaking a couple of laws,
Only a
in
couple. It's
doing
not too
this.
bad. It's not too bad for a weekend, is it?
regardless of my intent. But I could also, if I was just to go rogue and initiate this, if law enforcement is actively engaged in any takedown or investigation, I could be tainting their evidence. I could be destroying stuff that they're using if they're going to try and do a takedown and bring these people to justice. So on one hand, yes, I could do the internet some good by cleaning it up, but on the other hand, I could have like some fairly damaging effect.
It'd be more like Deadpool than Superman, though.
Absolutely, yes.
Is this what they call? Oh, I think you've called hack the hacker, but I call hacking back. This is that sort of. So, is this a movement? Are there like people who are totally down with this and think this is what we should all do?
Isn't this
So
what
I
active
wanted-
cyber defense is?
Kind of, yeah. And I was interested in that exact same question. So I took to my two favorite social media platforms, Twitter and LinkedIn, and I have very different like social bubbles on each. And I asked the same poll. Given the knowledge of this, after engaging with law enforcement, what would you do? And LinkedIn were very much like, you don't do anything, like you don't publish, you never talk about it again, and just forget that it ever existed.
Boring.
Whereas my connections on Twitter were very much in the I want all the details. And in fact, a couple of people even came out, and I'm going to say in jest, they absolutely went like vigilante this all
Oh,
the
I
way
saw
up.
one guy comment. DM me all the details and don't ask any questions.
Yes, and that's my
Trust
public
him,
stuff.
Kev. Just trust him.
I've actually had a significant amount of DMs and private communications with people asking me for all the details, and like looking at these people, there's some very questionable people in the list, and
Yeah, don't
yeah,
trust people on Twitter. We know about people on Twitter.
yeah, and like I'm active with law enforcement, and once I close off all those circles, then I may publish some more details, but I don't think I'd ever go down the route of publishing everything. But again, that's a conversation I'll have with law enforcement, with guidance, and with general counsel, if appropriate.
But that's important for you, right? Is this was a time when you could think, what I do right now, I could go to jail for the rest of my life potentially, if I do the wrong thing.
And we're seeing this in the
hackers,
news.
I don't know if you know, hackers never get caught. So it's fine.
Well, no, not real hackers, but because
Oh, that's
there's
a
a few.
Marcus.
Marcus
Yeah,
Hutchinson,
Marcus
who's
Hutchins.
the anniversary of WannaCry, brought this up.
And there's a few others who have. I think there was the Hack the Back guy in America, and he hacked back, hacked the hackers, but the hacker was using an American proxy, so the FBI turned up and he goes to jail.
The other thing you've got
happens.
The other thing you've got to consider is the attackers aren't using their own computers. If the attackers have hijacked a supercomputer in the EU, for instance, like
hang on, your spoilers. We haven't got there yet.
Segue.
By going in and interacting with that, I could be affecting like some other businesses. It's just because it's a hacker operating, it doesn't mean it's running on their infrastructure. And the Computer Misuse Act in the UK, I would be breaking that if I were to do any of this.
Whoa. I think it's time for my button.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
This is all very valid stuff. And of course, we've thought about this here at Immersive Labs. And so we have a collection of labs that are specifically designed for people who want to understand the ethics of hacking, what you can't do in both the UK. We've got some stuff related to the US law as well, right? And
yes.
And our users find them super helpful. They're some of the most popular labs on the platform, aren't they?
They are, and they're really useful if you're just getting into cybersecurity, especially if you're getting into bug hunting and things like that, like the ethical disclosure side of the house. Understanding, it's more about protecting yourself, making sure that you don't accidentally cross a line that you think is safe to cross. Understanding those is really important. And then, like you said, we answer all these questions for you in some really good labs.
Max, you want to talk a little bit about how some of that content is being used for an initiative with I think it's the National Crime Agency, isn't it, here in the UK?
So National Crime Agency are running it along with all the national police forces in the UK, which I actually think is one of the most innovative things that I've heard police do with young people in terms of cyber. Is that they're through their cyber prevent network, They get young people onto our platform, and obviously they do these. They have to do these ethics labs first before they get access to the rest of the platform. But once they've done these ethics labs, they then have full access to our platform to learn. In a measured way that they can't do any damage to anyone else, because that's the whole point of our platform. They can actually learn cybersecurity, and it's really innovative in that, a few years ago, I think everyone would say if they caught a hacker, they're just, however old they were, they go, well, he's a criminal. But now it's really interesting thing they're doing with us, in that they know these guys and girls are incredibly talented and could be some of the leading cybersecurity people in the future. So why not develop them more, rather than slap them on the wrist and tell them to stop doing what they're doing? So it's really good thing we're doing with the police there.
Great. Kev already alluded to the very last thing that we're going to talk about just as we wrap up, and that is, many of you may have read, the hacking of or the compromising of a supercomputer. And I have to be honest, I thought supercomputers and mainframes and all that kind of stuff, I didn't think any of that really existed anymore. So I was quite surprised to even read about this as a term and that this thing existed. But apparently there it is in a university. It's a thing that exists, and it's been compromised for the purposes of crypto mining. That I don't know if you know, it's a very advanced and sophisticated threat, crypto mining. But it seems to be the one thing that everyone wants to do with any kind of resource. We need a crypto mining button. Yeah, a jingle for crypto mining. So I guess the first question is, like, how does one go about hacking a supercomputer? And obviously, as always, why crypto mining?
So the way in isn't by directly attacking a supercomputer. Supercomputers, lots of processors, mainframes, like custom like hardware and custom software, they're really, really difficult to understand. So you usually have some kind of controller. So some kind of host system where you can go on and you can issue commands out to the cluster runs it, returns your responses. So best we can tell from the stuff I've read, it was actually one of those that was compromised. And it seems to be, from some of the discussions, that this wasn't anything really novel. It seems that some people had their SSH keys compromised. SSH is the command line access into one of these terminals. It's usually very command line driven. So it looks like somebody had their SSH keys compromised because they weren't fully protected, and that led to further compromise, at which point the attackers, faced with a couple of thousand CPUs in front of them, thought, I could probably mine some cryptocurrency on here fairly quickly. And that seems to be what has been deployed onto them.
What happened? Can we take a step back? What does one use a supercomputer for?
Mathematical computations is typically one of the big ones.
Some of the stuff they were being used for this time was coronavirus. So analyzing.
Oh, so it's like crunching numbers.
Yeah.
Oh, so I have this thing on my phone that when my phone is plugged in overnight,
Folding at home.
It's doing something to do with medical research. So is it kind of related to that? Yeah.
What supercomputers are super good at, though, is hashing, which is, of course, the core of Bitcoin mining. Now, I reckon, like, I don't know how recently this hack was obviously recent, but there will have been a crossover point, where the hardware-specific miners that like properly talent, because it's all about power, isn't it? Right? Bitcoin mining is you've got to do the hashing at low power consumption, such that you're making more money than you're chewing in electricity, right? And at some point, the economics would have crossed over on this. But it would have been a bloody good idea, like maybe 3-4 years ago, to compromise a supercomputer and get it to do the hashes, because that's what they're really good at. The trouble is that the economics have got poorer. So these hackers who compromised the supercomputer, geniuses, could have brought the whole Bitcoin network down, because they can hash so quickly that it kind of devalues the currency, except they're 3 years, 4 years, 5 years too late.
We're getting a bit off topic, but so Bitcoin goes to a Bitcoin fold every couple of years. So it's where they artificially increase the difficulty level for exactly those. They reduce the amount of Bitcoin available in the world by increasing the difficulty. and they'd predicted that this was going to have like massive ramifications. Turns out it passed almost silently. Cryptocurrency is although it's still volatile, it's less volatile than it used to be.
I do just want to point out that these guys hacked a supercomputer. It has the word super in front of it, so that means it's incredibly impressive. And that was what they did with it. That was what they did.
What else were you going to do with it?
I mean, the genius of it is the economics of crypto mining, isn't it? Is as Paul said, the money you spend on the power versus now if you hack someone else's computer, you're not spending any money on power, so it's all profit anyway. So
If a criminal organization focused its energy on completely stealthily using hundreds and hundreds of business computers to mine cryptocurrency, and then use that money for something good, would we have a problem with that?
it's that we use that money for something good is the bit you added on the end there.
Let's say they gave it all to... I'm going to make it really hard for you now. They gave it all to UNICEF.
So it's Robin Hood.
Yeah, basically.
Well, this
Yeah,
kind
Robin,
of
it's Robin Hood, from the rich give to the poor.
links us all back to Anubis, because that's what Anubis was doing. Is only when you weren't looking at your phone, it would do some crypto mining. So it's quite an interesting loop back.
Yeah, like when your laptop is left on and you're not using it, if that processing power is being used by something else, potentially for good, is that a thing that a business should care about?
The difference is I've been given the option.
Yeah, like you installed that software, Chris.
I
yourself.
chose to donate my time, my money. An attacker taking that away from me, and if that supercomputer was about to process a load of incoming data for COVID-19, they've just had to terminate accounts, reset keys, so researchers now can't get onto that. So regardless of the attacker's motivations, still bad.
Oh, I'm not saying their motivations were good. I was just chucking out a hypothetical, as it was the ethics episode. Well, it has been educational and informative and mildly entertaining. I don't have my outro, so I should find that and then I will carry on. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe, rate, and comment wherever you get your audio content. And if you want to know more about Immersive Labs, you can find us at immersivelabs.com or follow us on Twitter at Immersive Labs UK. Until next time, from all of us, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.